A savant in the field of jazz and classical music, diagnosed with pervasive developmental disorder, a form of autism at the age of 3. He disliked all forms of noise, including music. However, at the age of 6, he started to teach himself how to read piano music and began to teach classical music and jazz. He is a graduate of the Manhattan School of Music and the Berklee College of Music. As well as performing alongside some of the biggest names in the jazz industry, he has collaborated and recorded 12 music albums and is a Bosendorfer piano artist. An intense passion for music has landed him gigs in the world-renowned Carnegie Hall and the International VSA Arts Festival. An inspiration to many, he maintains a respectable balance between a professional musical career and teaching. Let us welcome Matt Savage. He will be speaking on music and how it influences adulthood.
Hello, Trivandrum. How are you? my name is Matt Savage. I'm a jazz pianist and composer. And this is actually my first time in India, so I'm really excited. So I'd like to sort of do a topic that's a little bit different from how I might usually do a presentation. It's how music influences adulthood. Because for me, music has been a big test of flexibility. Like, it's a very different lifestyle from how someone on the spectrum would normally handle a professional career. So there are all these little variables in terms of my life that have proven to develop in interesting ways. So I figured I'd go over that over the course of the presentation. Let's see what we got. So I was diagnosed with autism, PDD, pervasive developmental disorder, at age 3. And I've been playing music since I was 6 years old. And I've recorded about a dozen albums as a leader. When I was a kid, I was coming out with an album every year, which is traditionally how it was done in the jazz world, although things have changed a little bit. So recording has always been a part of my life, performing has always been a part of my life, but then there are, of course, other aspects of an artist's life that I'll get into. So what it means to perceive music on the spectrum, this is a big one. So how many of you are familiar with the concept of perfect pitch? Absolute pitch, yeah. So it means that you can tell a note without having a reference pitch first. So I can tell that a note's a D without having to hear a C first. For a lot of musicians can tell that it's a D, but they have to hear another note like a C or an E first and know what it is. And then there's also the issue of attention span. In terms of my personal experience, I tend to think of autism as attention span, and that's not, of course, it's deeply neurological. There are a whole bunch of different causes and effects, but I think of it almost as a sort of attention span, because I can tell the pitch of a note instantly, but context is a lot harder for me. So a lot of people who are more social or extroverted, they would notice the lyrics of a song first, but the problem is for me that it's hard for me to hear the lyrics, especially if the music is loud and booming underneath. A lot of times I can hear the vocals just fine, but identifying the meaning, it requires a little bit of ear squinting. You can't really say squinting if it's with your ears instead of your eyes, am I correct? Anyway, yeah, so here's some great examples of how, about how someone on the spectrum with certain augmented capabilities or sensitivities might hear different styles of music. I've included 2 waveforms here. One of them has lots of quiet parts and lots of loud parts. And then the one on the right is just a big booming rock and roll song. So the question is, what kind of details can you hear? Can you hear the pianissimo in some classical piece? Can you hear the lyrics in some punk song if it's if it sometimes feels like it's 9/10 guitars. So, and as a professional musician, I've really had to work on this, and it's helped me listen to human speech a lot more. It's helped me to understand the context of artworks a lot more, like what the meaning might be, because sometimes it's a little bit more subtle than one might think. And then at the bottom, I've included a C scale. Like, the first three notes on the left I would think of as do, re, mi, sa, re, ga. Well, actually, most people would think of it that way right away. But since I can hear pitches so immediately, I would actually hear it as C, D, E first. And then I could say that it's do, re, mi, or in Indian music would be sa, re, ga. So, let's see. So I did undergo a sensory integration therapy, specifically auditory, and it was during a time of desensitization for me. I went through a whole bunch of therapies, and for me it had to be very gradual because I was very sensitive. Music wasn't completely eliminated from my childhood, but it played almost no part because most of the time I would be too sensitive to handle it. Back one. Yeah, there we go. So now music, especially nowadays, it's very social, of course. You do interviews, you do blog posts, you take a lot of pictures, a lot of video. And that's not, of course, is not how I thought of music as a kid. Like, if you think of music as a series of D flats and Fs and A flats, you kind of miss the point, because music has existed, like music just didn't come out of the blue a lot of the time. Like, in many ways we're all products of our time. So I had to learn to make eye contact during interviews and make announcements during shows. Like, I could talk about, I could give you the exact composer name and enunciate it in a very exact way, but that might not be quite as interesting in terms of public performance. So you have to interact a bit with the audience, establish a rapport, a little back and forth conversation. So this all happened very quickly because my first public performances were about a year after I first learned the piano at age 6. I taught myself the C scale the first week and then got piano lessons the next week. That was at age 6. And then I was recording some solo piano albums. I consider them sort of demo albums right now, but they were still recordings. That was at age 8. And then I first really started playing jazz at age 9. But the question is, how did I handle it a lot of the time? Through sheer willpower sometimes. And so, a lot of this was later on, actually. Like, I should clarify. Like, people ask sometimes, how did you feel at such a young age? Did you feel overwhelmed? Did you feel exhausted? Like, did you feel homesick or lonely? And the truth is, I wasn't feeling things that intensely sometimes. Like, it was all new to me. I didn't think of it as a big step, but as I became a teenager, as I started going to college, I started realizing that most people's connection between the social and the artistic sides of music is cut out a little bit differently. And ultimately promoting yourself is really exhausting. Like, here's a great example of, over here, what it means to pay attention. Like, for example, the screen behind me is a lot bigger than I am. I mean, I'm only 5.5 feet tall, so my arm span is not that large. So, of course, I would more naturally notice the screen first because it's bigger. But that's not the social prioritization that's more automatic in more neurotypical people. Let's see. different perceptions of artistry. So different artists market themselves differently. Some of them say, oh, I'm moving to Hollywood, I'm moving to New York. Some of them say, I'm an activist for a great cause. And then some of them some artists think they're not that marketable, like over here on the left, because they think of themselves as artists with a capital A, separate from all the music, separate from all the schmoozing and the social aspect of things. That's what I meant. So we have these different ideas about how marketable you are, how virtuosic you are, how relevant you are, and and of course artists sometimes have to deal with a lot of flack, but the truth of the matter is that it's just like autism is not so easily defined, artistry is not so easily defined, and I'm going to get into that later. So, and because it took me so long to learn this, I had to become a lot more flexible in order to realize that kind of have to talk the talk and walk the walk a little bit. So, and then this music industry is really urban. If you're doing folk music, you can get a lot more rural gigs, but for a genre like jazz, it's the big city life. You have to be thrust into the most overwhelming places. And I included a picture of Shanghai over here. In a couple of weeks, I'm going to visit that city for the first time. If you talk about the city proper and not the metro area, it's probably the largest city in the world. So, could you live in the biggest city in the world, or at least commute there every day? Now, how about learning the local language and bringing your gear too? There are all these things that non-musicians don't think about a lot of the time. Because if you're an international traveler, you're going to pick up please and thank you in a couple of languages. Like, I didn't know any words of Malayalam before coming here, but I enjoy saying nani. But then, bringing your gear, this is a big one. Since I'm a keyboardist, it's really easy if I'm at a place that offers a piano or keyboard. But if I'm bringing it myself, I have to bring the keyboard, I have to bring the amp, I have to bring the bench if I want to be comfortable, the keyboard stand, the music stand if I'm reading music, and then all the cables necessary. And it's a lot to think about. So I tend to want to prepare a lot of stuff for me. I tend to want to prepare early on, but sometimes I run out of time, and that's hard for me to adjust to. And also driving's a big one, like learning all those road signs. It's like learning another language. Of course, coming from India, it's a little bit different. But if you're from, Indiana, then it's hard to process the idea of driving in Boston, which I do regularly. And everybody thinks Boston has the worst traffic in the world, but I do it. Let's see. So in many ways, you're your own travel agent. If you want to do an interview with a multicultural organization, you might want to learn another language. If you, like all my students who are studying abroad, well, students and friends, like a lot of times they have English as a second language instead of a first one. And I've done interviews in Spanish before. So not only are the life skills flexible, but your hours are flexible. Like sometimes I think that I have it easy because I don't have a 9-to-5 job per se, even though I do a lot of college teaching these days. I just started at Bunker Hill Community College. So the hours are pretty flexible. Like I can do doctor's appointments without having to reschedule a whole bunch of things. But But in truth, I still get tired a lot doing my work because there are so many things that you don't think about, like that I've mentioned here, like paying attention to somebody, even if it doesn't seem natural, or doing interviews, figuring out flights. Let's see what. All right, yeah. So, and then talking points, now that I've synthesized all this information, then I have to learn to balance it. Like sometimes, depending on if I'm going to an autism event or somewhere else, I talk about autism. Sometimes if I'm doing a more casual interview or a television appearance, I'll talk about my lifestyle. I'll talk about things like how I love to ski or something. And now, if I had my way, I would talk about jazz licks and how different styles of music vary. I would talk about that all day, but at the same time, you have to keep it interesting. So, the act of being this flexible and creating a second social presence for audiences helps adjust those with autism to the unpredictability of adulthood. So just like the gig scene is unpredictable, the adult work life is unpredictable. Like, so many people on the spectrum, they end up choosing very steady jobs, like clock in at 9, clock out at 5. But anything can happen. Like, you could arrive to work and find that the door's locked. I don't know. You could have 5 clients in one day and just 1 the next day. So, and music is perhaps, being a musician is in many ways the best way to prepare for this, because just about anything can happen. I've had gigs canceled at the last minute. I've had gigs that did happen successfully and then something else has fallen apart. There are some good ones. Like, I just remember I once volunteered, once in Boston, I volunteered at a juvenile detention center just for 1 hour, and somebody had actually brought a keyboard there, but forgot to bring the power supply, the power cable. So I was there, and I couldn't play. I just had to play some bongos or something, because there were a whole bunch of other musicians there. So we all have stories. That's one of many. But it's all part of this great learning experience. All right. Yep, and then, so then, of course, music is a little unpredictable, but every once in a while, you have to make a decision that's really big, like finding an apartment, getting your own car, or finding your first sweetheart, maybe. So, and of course, these things are perceived as more normal, I guess, because just about everybody goes through them, but they still require an enormous amount of flexibility, like to suddenly find out that you can't rent an apartment and you have to find another one, or you had a delay on your subway line or something. It's not something that's thought about all the time, but it's something that requires an enormous amount of adaptation. And then you have to market your own music, and then of course, you have to figure out how flexible you are as an artist. Is this jazz? Is this jazz? Is this jazz? So that's what I mentioned about creating a second social presence. It's not necessarily fake or not you, but it's something that's it's just a new personality or a new artistic outlook created when you have to adapt to your surroundings. And then there are things that are not always expected, but always necessary, as I mentioned, like business skills, travel skills, language skills, English or foreign, since English is my first language. Da, 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 da. You can do all sorts of things to attract new audiences, some more social, some involving TV, or now, in the last minute, I'm going to mention something about how music careers are not always what we think they are. I wish I had a comparison for the late, great Aretha Franklin, who passed away yesterday, but I have an example here. Jimi Hendrix versus Chuck Berry. You've probably heard of both of them, right? They're both black icons of classic rock and roll, and but here's the deal. Jimi Hendrix lived to be 27, and Chuck Berry lived to be 90. He actually came out with an album last year, just before he passed on. So nobody knows where their career is going to go. Nobody knows how reputations are going to come and go. I mean, if you're a musician, people say you have the career for the rest of your life, and I've had this playing and teaching career. It's been wonderful, but I have to adapt, and so any arts industry is not what you think it is. So, and of course, Jimi Hendrix and Chuck Berry, they lived radically different lives, but we know their names and we have their artistry. It's a gift to all of us. So, thank you so much. It's good to be here in India.